So for the benefit of everyone who's here in person, yes, thank you for coming. This lecture is going to be streamed as best we can. As you can tell from the number of laptops open, it is a slightly ad hoc procedure. We are doing our best at the moment because we've had to shift locations. However, none of you in the audience will be visible, so it's just us for the Q&A session, just so people have got a little bit more human interaction than staring at a screen. If at the end of the talk you'd like to ask a question, put your hand up. We'll repeat the question so that everyone online hears it and knows what is going on. So don't worry about that. You shouldn't be audible as far as I understand it. If you would like to leave partway through, if the talk isn't what you'd anticipated, or if you've got something urgent to get to, or if you need a comfort break, absolutely fine. The exit's just there. Just if you can be quiet as you're doing so, that would be much appreciated. In the event of fire, we're going to join the main evacuation, which is out through the back, and then assemble on the square, but you should have no issues. Everyone will be going in the same direction, unless they're wearing high vis, in which case they are the fire brigade. Does anyone have any questions before we start? Lovely. Perfect. Thank you very much for coming along. Ellie, you okay? So it's about 1 minute past. So having given everyone a little bit of time to file in, I'm now going to make a start, which means I need to stop share here and start the video here and then spotlight. So hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 10th lecture in the Royal Armouries Winter Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Mark Bennett, I'm the Research Manager. Thank you very much for joining us today. You do join us in slightly straitened technical circumstances, as you will see from the slightly different appearance. Yes, we are doing the best we can. Apologies for any inconvenience or any issues with the technical side of things. The Royal Armouries, for the benefit of those who aren't aware of us, is the UK's national collection of arms and armour. We began life as a medieval stockpile of weapons at the Tower of London, although very little remains of that historic stockpile. Eager to cut a dash on the European battlefield, Henry VIII updated the collection by disposing of much of the earlier material. Including today's object, what we have has been painstakingly reassembled in a process that started with the Victorian revival of interest in the medieval period and continues to the present day. So as the weather improves, we are fittingly coming to the end of our winter lecture series. We will close out with a talk on the Women of SOE's F section, of which more later. However, there'll also be a summer lecture series featuring talks by current doctoral students. This will run in July and August of this year. Keep an eye out for more details, but we're hoping for talks on Bengal female revolutionaries of the 1930s, psychological trauma and the Roman Empire, medieval Syrian siege warfare, and British military families in the Napoleonic period. Following that, we'll have a brand new winter lecture series for you in autumn 2024. On some technical matters, after today's talk, we'll be taking questions from the Zoom Q&A function, the YouTube chat, and from here live at the Royal Armouries. If you're submitting them online, send them in as they occur to you, and I'll put them to the speaker after the talk. I can't guarantee to get through them all. I can't guarantee to cover them as popular ones, but we will do as many as we can. You can also add captions if you're hard of hearing. There's a CC button at the bottom of the screen in both Zoom and YouTube. Apologies if you haven't been able to enjoy the talks fully because of captioning or audio issues. We are working to solve those, but we're sort of learning by doing at the moment. Technical issues, raise a hand in Zoom, refresh in YouTube, and if you're in the audience, sadly, you will just have to put up with us. I apologise. So with the technical factors out of the way, let me introduce today's event. Every object that we have tells a fascinating story about humanity and its glories and failings. However, only a select few of our objects are sufficiently significant to be designated treasures. And today's lecture is about one of those objects, the Warwick Shaffron. To tell us more about this object, we have our Assistant Curator of Arms and Armour, Ellie Wilkinson-Keys. Ellie's been working with the Warhorse project at the University of Exeter to understand the medieval warhorse, and she's going to help us understand one of the key pieces of evidence on which they're drawing. So without any further ado, over to you, Ellie.
Thank you, Mark. Hello, everybody. The purpose of my talk today is to bring you in on some of the work I've been involved in recently, which features the Warwick Shaffron. I really wanted to share what we can understand and interpret from this object, as well as update you on some newer research that has been taking place. I've structured my talk so we'll have a good close-up look at the Shaffron, but I also wanted to give you some background to horse armour more generally. Hopefully this will explain a little bit about why this object is considered a collection treasure, but also to discuss how and why we arrive at certain interpretations of the object. So first, I'll give a brief overview of the timeline of European horse armour. I'll plant the Warwick Shaffron within that timeline, and then we can take a closer look to understand why it's an important benchmark in European horse head defences. In the third part of the lecture, I'd like to introduce you to the Warhorse project, an exciting project run by the University of Exeter in East Anglia, which asks the question, what was the medieval warhorse? And I'll explain a little bit about that project later on and how the Warwick Shaffron has featured in that research. So we can also try and turn my slides. Oh, there we go. The Warwick Shaffron is now over 600 years old and has been the subject of interest and research for a very long time. Probably the first published description of it was as early as 1656, and a lot of what we know about the Shaffron, therefore, isn't all new information. And part of what we do here at the Armouries is to facilitate the development of what we do know about this material to help bring about new ways of understanding these objects in the context of their past stories. So the Warwick Shaffron has been interpreted by several important scholars in the field of arms and armour studies, and it's really their work that enables us to more fully understand and appreciate this object that we're looking at today. The Warwick Shaffron currently lives in this case in the War Gallery, and that's here at the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds. The case tells the story of the development of European arms and armour within the 14th and early 15th centuries. This was a time of huge technological advancement for arms and armour. We see the full realisation of plate armour technology, and the ways in which warfare of this period evolves is both in response to and also driving some of these developments. The Warwick Shaffron has a prominent place in this display case because it's unique as a keystone in the story of horse armour around this time. And for anyone here in person today, I will be very happy to show you where the Shaffron lives and some of the other objects I'm going to mention on display in the galleries. As you probably guessed by now, the Warwick Shaffron is a horse head defence, and chaffron is the term that relates to armour worn to protect the horse's face and head. The term encompasses horse head defences of various forms made from hardened leather, metal and mail. The latter, and obviously, and even ceremonial or parade chaffrons made from a sort of papier-mâché, although the latter obviously not designed to be defensive and used as more of a mask or a costume. The Warwick Shaffron is unique and important because not only is it the earliest known example of European chaffron made of metal plates, but because it's the only known example of a form understood to be in use from around the mid to late 14th century. Later chaffrons from the mid to late 15th century, and certainly from the 16th and into the 17th centuries, survive in much larger numbers. The Royal Armouries, for example, holds around 60 European chaffrons, the majority are 16th century. The earliest full chaffron after the Warwick Shaffron in the Armouries collection dates to about 70 years later. And when I say full chaffron, I mean a horse head defence that extends down most, if not all, the length of the face. Half chaffrons tend to stop just beneath eye level, as you can see in the image on the right there. Both these examples are on display, both the 16th century, made at the Royal Workshops at Greenwich, and both are really lovely examples of chaffrons being decorated to match the armour for the man. You can see the corresponding armour for Robert Dudley and John Smythe displayed with these examples out in the war and tournament galleries. The Dudley chaffron now on the left is also a fabulous example of, just like armour for the man, horse armour can have pieces taken off and added to them depending on the occasion, and this chaffron is cleverly made in two pieces. The lower piece can be removed if a half chaffron is desired. Horse armour appears in Central Europe from around the mid to late 11th century. It was in use elsewhere much earlier than this, for example, from around the 3rd millennium BC in Mesopotamia, so what we now know as modern-day Iraq and parts of Turkey, Syria and Iran, and from the 2nd millennium BC in other regions of the Middle East and Egypt. It seems to have also been used by Roman heavy cavalry. It does seem to have fallen out of use in Europe from around the 6th century and then reappears in historical record around the late 11th century. It was probably re-established across Europe by the mid to late 12th century. In this early period, horses were protected by trappers, also known as a caparison, of quilted fabric or mail, or a combination of both, as well as by small plates sewn into textiles. And I've included a small image there of the inside of a brigandine, which is a type of body armour for the man, just to illustrate what I mean by small plates sewn into textiles, although this example is much later, but the principle is the same. And there's a small image of mail there as well. So these are some of the materials that are being used to cover the large surface area of the horse in lieu of the iron and steel plate technology that comes a bit later. I've also included here a cropped image from Froissart, which is a 15th century depiction of a late 14th century joust. I use this just to give you a visual of what a caparison sometimes looks like. And if you've seen me talk about horse armour before, you'll know that I really like this image because the horses look very pleased with themselves and how elegant they look. And you can see, if you look closely, you can see that a couple of them are wearing chaffrons over the face and a neck plate defence, although I should say here that this is a later depiction, so it probably more accurately represents the equipment of the period the manuscript was made, rather than the joust that it's illustrating. Although horse armour exists in the historical record from about the late 12th century, the earliest surviving pieces of armour date from about 300 to 400 years later. So our understanding of this material prior to about 1400 is reliant on manuscript illuminations, surviving sculpture and other iconography, as well as interpreting brief written descriptions in inventories and wardrobe accounts. What's really tricky when examining these sources is not only trying to establish what accurate form horse armour takes, but also exactly what materials are being represented. So I've used two examples here of chess pieces. These two chess pieces are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection. The one on the left is depicting a horse wearing mail, which is often shown in manuscripts and on sculpture as this sort of lines of squiggles or little crescents. But the overlaid panels, it's unclear what material is being represented here. So probably textile, or it might be hardened leather, which could be then painted or have a textile cover, but really difficult to know. And I should say here that the legs of this horse aren't surviving. This isn't showing a horse that is covered from nose to hoof, if you like, although bars of that length were worn. If you want to know more about these two pieces, sorry, I missed it. The chess piece on the right is a later date, but it's clearly showing much more rigid plates, and these are probably leather. They could be metal. It's not clear, but probably leather. If you want to know more about the two pieces on this slide, the Metropolitan's Collections Online page has some really interesting interpretations and evidence as to why they've drawn the conclusions they have, so that's worth checking out if you want to. Added to the difficulties of establishing materials being used, horses are also often depicted in iconography wearing these long fabric caparisons, as we saw on the previous slide. They sometimes cover the horse's face and can extend right down to the hooves. They are excellent identifiers when covered in heraldry and symbolism, as you can see in this example of Ulrich von Liechtenstein. But what we can't tell from this image is whether the horse is wearing any armour underneath. Horsehead defences of either leather or plate seem to have first appeared in Europe in the mid-13th century, followed by larger plate defences for the body. This example is the only known roughly contemporary chaffron to the Warwick Shaffron. It's dated to about the first half of the 15th century, and it's made of hardened leather. It's of a form understood to have been used in tournaments with this really wonderful comb, and as you can see from this example, it's been made to appear like feathers. This image is the earliest known full plate horse armour, which is sometimes called bard or barding. This one was made around 1450, and it includes a metal chaffron, a crinnet for the neck, a peytoil for the chest, and crupper for the hindquarters, and it would originally also have had flanchards which would protect the sides beneath the saddle. The time that this horse armour was made is the period when we see the full realisation of plate armour for man and horse. Now, you can see I've gone to very high-tech levels here to label up this bard. But this is the earliest bard in the Royal Armouries collection. This is what we call the Gothic horse armour, and it's on display here in the museum. It's a German horse armour, and it dates to around 1480. In addition to the main pieces of horse armour that we saw on the previous slide, horse furniture could also include steel rein protectors and saddle steels. And you can also see, just peeping behind the horse here, a tail plate, which takes the form of a basilisk, which is very fun. And I've included a full view of that for you, just so you can see that. Horses were sometimes equipped in some or all of the pieces depicted here, depending on the occasion and the wealth and the preferences of the rider. Full surviving horse armour from the 15th century is extremely rare. This is one of only around 4 examples from this period. And for those attending in person, if you do get the opportunity to view the Gothic horse armour in the War Gallery, it is a magnificent display that truly demonstrates the power and technology of warfare in this period. For the mounted knight, protecting his horse as much as himself was essential, and horse armour provided some defence on the battle and tournament field against edged weapons and projectiles such as arrows, pikes, lances, other staff weapons, and of course sword blows. The introduction of new technologies to armour making doesn't necessarily mean that other materials associated with earlier periods fall out of use. Leather bards remained popular, although very few survive. This is a rare leather horse bard from about 1540 in the Armouries collection, and I just wanted to illustrate what leather horse armour looks like. This view is from the top, looking down on the hindquarters. So that was an overview of the development of horse armour in Europe. I wanted to highlight what the story of horse armour looks like to us in terms of the surviving material culture. And the key takeaway is that horse armour prior to around 1450 is extremely rare, and we are reliant on other sources to paint a picture of how horses were equipped. So back to the Warwick Shaffron. It's the earliest surviving example of a European plate chaffron. It's believed to be English, and it dates to around 1400. It's possibly as early as the last years of the 14th century. You can see from these images that the chaffron is formed of a large metal plate which entirely covers the face and has a prominent ridge in the centre. It has a domed muzzle and domed eye guards, which are both pierced with large circular holes. These enable the horse to see and breathe. At the top, there are holes for the ears. These almost certainly originally held metal ear guards riveted on, but these are sadly no longer surviving. You can see in these images the large side plates and the rear plates as well that extend back. There are also holes on the top edge of the chaffron, which are consistent with those used to attach a crinnet to protect the horse's neck. I really wanted to show you these because unfortunately you can't see the way that on display the way that the chaffron is in the case. You can see 4 surviving holes here, and it's likely that these would originally have been 3 pairs of holes. And you can just make that out. Apologies for the quality of that zoomed in image, but I just wanted to show you, we can just make out the second hole in that image that has been broken out because of some material loss. Now, it's likely that these holes were used to tie on a neck defence with these 3 pairs of holes. We don't know what form that crinnet will have taken. It could have been made of mail, it could have been plate and articulated like we saw on the Gothic chaffron, or it might have been a combination of both mail and plate. I've just zoomed in to show you another snap of the chaffron there. This is to show a line of small holes right along the edge of the chaffron. These are called points, and they were probably used to tie in a replaceable textile liner, which, like armour for the man, would have been made, would have helped to make the armour more comfortable, as well as help to absorb the energy of any blows. The Warwick Shaffron is of high quality, although it is plain, it is of high quality. And it's a good example of the art and the craft of the armour in this period. The only decoration is the scalloped edge, which you can see just from that close-up picture. And this is where the main faceplate overlaps the side and rear plate. So that scalloped edge is right the way round the horse's head. The chaffron is very fragile now, at over 600 years old. I measured that the metal in places around the ear holes, edge of the rear plate and edge of the side plates is between 1 and 2.5 millimetres thick. Although these images do highlight its fragility, it would have been robust at the time of its use. The chaffron bears no visible maker's mark and nothing about its maker is known. More clearly visible on the inside, there appears to be 3 radiating lines at the bottom on the underside of the muzzle. This is possibly to help to box it around the end of the nose or shape it around the end of the nose. And we can also see traces of the ear guards, and I've zoomed in again on one of those images just to show you in the bottom right that this is part of the lip of the ear guard, which enables the guard to be riveted onto the chaffron from the underside. There are also 92 surviving rivets, which are flush on the outside. We can't see them on the outside. And these are also lining rivets. So this is common on a lot of surviving armour. These would have held strips of leather to which the lining could be sewn. So just to illustrate this, I've included some close-ups of 2 very rare surviving liners in 2 chaffrons in the Royal Armouries collection. There's no way of knowing, unfortunately, if the surviving textile here is contemporary to the object of use, although I think it's probably likely. These do give us an idea, though, of how lining bands and textile liners work. So the staining here on the right image is probably because of probably as a result of the leather band that sits underneath it. And then you can see that the textile liner is then sewn over this, and you can see the stitches in both those images there, and just to give you an idea of what that liner might have looked like. The stitching also means, of course, that the liner can be easily cut out and replaced when it gets gross and sweaty, and that's exactly the same principle for armour for the man. In the top left, you can see what I mean by the lip for the ear guard. This is an example of an ear guard made of just a single front plate. The ear guards on the Warwick Shaffron were possibly tubular, but the principle is the same. It has this sort of upturned lip that just rivets to the inside of the main plate. Although we don't know who made the Shaffron, we do know that it's probably from the armoury of the Earls of Warwick. It's possibly originally belonged to Richard Beauchamp, the 13th Earl of Warwick, who died in 1439. Richard had an active military career in the first decades of the 15th century and was particularly celebrated for his skills at tournament events. This image is from a 15th century manuscript made for Richard's daughter Anne, who died in 1492, and this shows Richard competing in a tournament. It's like the image we saw from Froissart. It is a later depiction of an earlier event, so it is again probably depicting later equipment, but we can see that the horse is wearing a caparison, although interestingly this one is actually a trick, as he's wearing the heraldry of somebody else. And the horse is also wearing a crinnet to protect its neck, and it has a chaffron of the type that we see around the mid to late 15th century. It has roughly the same shape as the Gothic chaffron. Richard is a strong candidate as the original owner of the Warwick Shaffron, but it could also have belonged to his father Thomas, who also had an active military career, but who died in 1401. However, Thomas did spend the last few years of the 14th century either in retirement at Warwick Castle or imprisoned at the Tower of London. So it is possible that the chaffron was his, but based on the probable age of the chaffron, it's perhaps more likely that it was made and used by Richard. The chaffron seems to have remained at Warwick Castle from the time of its use until about 1970, when it was purchased by the Royal Armouries in 1987, and then moved up to Leeds when the museum opened in 1996. The Warwick example seems to belong to a form of horse head defence in use from around the end of the 14th century, which appears in iconography into the early parts of the 15th century. You can see that some of the examples here with similar features to the Warwick Shaffron are slightly earlier. One identifying feature of this early type of chaffron is a large rear plate covering the top of the horse's head. This gives the chaffron a sort of large hood-like appearance. And in the iconography, this rear plate seems to be inflexible. They're not hinged like we see in later examples, and this is also reflected in the Warwick example. What we also see on these late 14th century types is the bulbous muzzle, which covers the nose, and you can see this represented in these images, as well as also ear guards that seem to have been pierced in the same way as the muzzle and eye guards. So it is possible that any ear guards on the Warwick Shaffron might have been similar. Probably the closest comparable example in iconography to the Warwick Shaffron appears on this chess piece that we saw earlier from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's about 650 years old, and like the Warwick Shaffron, it's probably English, and it's currently dated to about 1360. It has the same hood-like form, fully enclosing with side and rear plates, and the bulbous muzzle. The two are not exactly the same, and if you do have a little game and spot the difference, you will see a couple of variations between the two. A key difference being that the eye guards on the chess piece are open. This is another example depicted on the tomb of Henry V at Westminster Abbey. This stone monument was made around 1437 to about 1450, but it was designed prior to Henry's death in 1422, which perhaps makes it more contemporary to the Warwick Shaffron. And again, you can see that it's of that very hood-like shape with the pierced ears, eyes and nose. Again, more high-tech features. I've highlighted some of the examples from around 1410 onwards, And in this period, chaffron seems to lose their inflexible rear plate, and the lower part of the face towards the nose becomes a lot narrower, less bulbous, and it loses the piercings, presumably because they're not needed if the nostrils are uncovered. The eye guards become more frequently open, like those on the chest piece, sometimes with a half cup-shaped guard, and the eye guard developed later into a small upturned plate, so the eye is fully open, but it would still provide some protection from a downward blow, perhaps from fellow mounted riders, as well as arrows. This is what we see by the mid to late 15th century, focusing particularly on the Gothic chaffron on the right. There is still the prominent medial ridge. It has side plates, ear guards, but the chaffron no longer covers the bottom of the nose. The eyes are open, uncovered, and the rear plate, or the pole plate, which protects the top of the horse's head, is much, much smaller, and it attaches either by a hinge or a leather strap, so it's not inflexible. And you can see actually on the example on the left that it moves very easily. This is it's on modern leathers, but it's attached in the same way as it would have been in the period of the chaffron's use, and you can see that it's moved easily when I took a picture of it lying flat. I've included this one in the left actually because this is the chaffron whose lining we saw earlier. This is the closest in date to the Warwick Shaffron, about 50 years, 70 years later. What we can't study, of course, from iconography is any damage that these objects sustain during their working life. And this is an aspect that makes the Warwick Shaffron even more unique. As you've seen from the images already, it bears some marks that are potentially very interesting when thinking about the effectiveness of horsehead protection. But any damage on surviving arms and armour must be considered carefully, as we can never say definitively whether visible damage is a result of real action on the battle or tournament fields, or if it's coincidental damage caused since the time of the object's use. But in the case of the Warwick Shaffron, we can more certainly say that at least some of the damage was probably sustained in a martial context. And that's because the marks and indentations are reasonably consistent with what we know about likely weapons in use at this time. So areas of damage on the Warwick Shaffron include material loss, particularly around the eyes and the end of the nose and the edge of the rear plate. There's a long dent above the right eye, a small impact point on the proper left side towards the top of the chaffron, a cut across the medial ridge about halfway down the face, and a dent in the centre towards the nose guard. I will be coming back to this image. This is a drawing from a 1786 publication of Francis Grose's A Treatise on the Ancient Armour and Weapons. And this shows that most of the damage that we see today was present by 1786. This is still around 400 years after the earliest period of the chaffron's use, but it does tell us at least that the chaffron hasn't sustained any significant material loss, further damage or deterioration since the 18th century. It also tells us that the ear guards were no longer present by 1786. The areas of material loss at the end of the nose and to the eye cages, I don't think we can examine these as potential evidence of damage sustained in action. The metal is very thin in these areas, around 1 millimetre, and its material loss is consistent with just general rusting, really. It's a very old object. It's been at Warwick Castle for a very long time. It is likely explained by just general rust. The other damage that we can perhaps be more certain about being sustained in battle or a tournament are the two cuts across the medial ridge, which are consistent with a blow of some force, and in fact the upper mark a lot across the medial ridge actually pierces the plate. The long crumpled dent along the right eye also seems to have been delivered by the edge of a bladed weapon. Again, an impact of some considerable force. It seems to have crumpled at least some portion of the top of the eye cage. The small puncture to the left of the medial ridge, when viewed up close, appears to be roughly the shape of an isosceles triangle, and it has also penetrated the plate. And it has previously been suggested that this mark may have been caused by a direct hit by an arrowhead. If that is the case, that could be evidence that the chaffron was used in battle rather than, or as well as, the tournament, because archery didn't feature in mounted tournament events. So I don't think we can rule out that this chaffron wasn't used at tournament. I think if this damage at the top there was produced by an arrowhead, we can almost certainly say then that that was probably from battle context. This brings us to the third part of my talk about how the Warwick Shaffron recently featured in exciting research led by the Warhorse project. This AHRC funded project ran from 2019 until 2023, although there are various strands of continuing work that have come out of the project. It was entitled Warhorse, Archaeology of the Military Revolution, and it was based at the Universities of Exeter and East Anglia, and it focused on getting closer to understanding the medieval European warhorse from around the period 800 to 1600. This is the homepage from the website, and it has a lot of really interesting resources and blog posts about the work that was undertaken. So do have a good look at that for much more in-depth detail than I'm going into today. I've taken this slide from a presentation given by the project because it outlines some of the key areas of focus. The Warhorse project is unique in that it brought together multiple disciplines in a way that wasn't really done before when examining the Warhorse, and that included zooarchaeology, so surviving horse bones, surviving material culture, chaffrons, landscapes and historical documentation, among many others. And so really this enabled a much more complete investigation of the warhorse using varied sources. And it is because of that that the project has been able to discover so much. One of the most significant findings of the Warhorse project came from measurements of a large sample of horse bones which established an average withers height. And the results from these findings showed that the average warhorse was around 13 hands, so about 132 centimetres. So horses are measured in hands. The average modern Shetland pony, just to put this in context, is around 7, 8, 9 hands. The findings are modern Shire horse around 16 to 19 hands. I think the drum horses that are currently used by the household cavalry are about 18 hands, so up to about 19 hands is about 193 centimetres. So the findings of the Warhorse project of 13 hands for an average warhorse understandably went viral, because the size and stature of the warhorse was up until this point largely unknown and generally believed to be very large animals, and have certainly been portrayed in popular culture as such. The modern definition of a pony, if you're interested, is 14.2 hands and under. So the medieval warhorse was much smaller than we may have initially believed, and the evidence does show a small minority of animals slightly larger, around 2.2% of the data set, and there is currently no known zooarchaeological evidence of a horse over 16 hands in the period 800 to 1600 in Europe. The wooden horses at the Tower of London, some of which are pictured here. My favourite is the mustard chappie on the left. Now, some of these date to the mid-16th century, and they have an average stature of 14.3 hands, so about 147 centimetres. So these horses are within the established range found by the Warhorse project. If you have certain long bone measurements, which is how the wither's height was established, you can also work out horse head size, which is amazing. So what the Warhorse project did next was to measure a large sample of European chaffrons in, I think it was about 10 collections, to see if these confirmed their findings. The chaffrons from 1450 survived in 1450 onwards survive in large numbers, and full-length chaffrons rather than half chaffrons are able to provide maximum measurements of the horse head size. The Warhorse project measured around 49 chaffrons in the Royal Armouries collection. This is part of the data sheet created by the project, which was used to record the measurements for the chaffrons. We recorded 22 measurements from each chaffron, and these points were designed to record landmark reference points that could be identified across a large number of chaffrons, and that was intended regardless of any variations in the chaffron's form, style, or any decorative elements that might have been included on there. And the project did also take measurements from 4 modern chaffrons that were made in a 16th century style and which had been made specifically to fit modern horses that are used for jousting events and who do carry a fully armoured rider. And these modern horses ranged between 14 and 16 hands. The results of the data collection showed that the chaffrons at the Royal Armouries do corroborate the evidence of the Warhorse project. So based on the measurements taken of those 49 chaffrons, they do appear to have fit horses within the size range offered by the zooarchaeological evidence, so no larger than 16 hands and on average 13 hands. Interestingly for us, because the Warwick Shaffron does appear to be large, it is within normal range for particular measurements, especially the eye to ear measurements when compared with other chaffrons in the collection. So in other words, it isn't dramatically larger than other chaffrons in the collection or other chaffrons that we expect to see in this period. The largest chaffron in the Armouries collection is that one that belongs to the silver and engraved armour of Henry VIII, although it too is still within normal range of an expected horse head size for this period. There's a few different views here of the chaffron because we've moved quite quickly through the slides. So these will be up for a moment, just if you wanted to have a closer look at the object. So the Warwick Shaffron is close in size to one of the modern chaffrons measured by the project, and that was one that was made and worn by a horse appropriately named Warlord. And Warlord is 15.2 hands high, which is about 154 centimetres, or just over 5 feet. Where the Warwick Shaffron is an outlier is in its width measurement. It appears to be about 10 centimetres wider than other later chaffrons in the collection, and about 10 centimetres wider than what we would expect. This is particularly interesting because the Warwick Shaffron sits within normal range for all the other measurements on that chaffron, so it's only the width measurement that makes it seem so large. And we believe that one of the explanations is that the Warwick Shaffron's width is taking into account a thick liner. And I should say here, if you're thinking what I was thinking, that was this a horse with just a particularly wide head, apparently that's not how horse head size works, and if it was as wide as that, then it would have been longer. And because handily it's of a type of chaffron that has the bottom of the nose covered, we do know the maximum length of the horse for this chaffron. So I should also say that suggesting that the Warwick Shaffron had a thick liner isn't new, it's just that this new evidence corroborates that a little bit further. And it does rule out that the horse wearing the chaffron was in normal range. This is not a chaffron for an animal of particularly large size. And just on the back of that, often with objects of this age, where there are a lot of unanswered questions, we do spend a lot of time waiting and hoping that new research and technologies will develop to help us prize out more information. And the Warwick Shaffron is, in my opinion, a really great example of when newer technologies and ideas come along that are able to confirm things that have previously been interpreted, as well as situating this object in a much wider context. So back to the width of the chaffron, it seems that there's room for about 5 centimetres of padding on either side. And of course, because the Warwick Shaffron is the only known example of its type, it's impossible to know if additional width to accommodate extra padding was an exception or the normal form of chaffrons and liners at the turn of the 15th century. As we've discussed, liners on chaffrons, as in the case of most armour from the medieval period, is extremely rare. And on both the examples I showed you earlier, the liner is only a few millimetres in thickness. But what we don't know, of course, is if, like the arming cap for the man worn beneath the helmet, did the horse wearing the Warwick Shaffron also wear some sort of thickly padded hood of some sort? And in our discussions about this possibility, Professor Alan Oughton came across this image of a mid-16th century model horse, which shows the presence of some sort of textile hood and additional padding, which might have been worn under a chaffron. This example does appear to only be showing 2 thin layers, but it could be that it's indicative that in some cases horses were wearing padding not accounted for in the few surviving examples of liners on chaffrons that do remain to us. And another point to think on is that we see the lining rivets for the lining band, and we know that a fixed but replaceable liner would have been sewn onto that. But we also have the row of small lining points for lacing and tying in a liner. So are these working together to secure one liner, or is the row along the edge, is that for an additional layer of lining? I don't know. This is speculative. I just wanted to put that out there and put that into the discussion. But So in conclusion, the Warwick Shaffron is an exceptional example of medieval European horse head defences because it is the earliest known example of a plate chaffron and the only representative example within material culture of the form in use in Europe around the end of the 14th century and into the first years of the 15th century. It contributes to the new and original research of the Warhorse project by providing measurements which correlate to a large zooarchaeological data set. And this data establishes for the first time that the horse used in a battlefield context in medieval Europe was on average 13 hands high and no larger than 16 hands. What we have previously understood as a chaffron belonging to a horse of exceptional size can now be recognised as a chaffron representative of the normal horse head range, both alongside other chaffrons in the collection of the Royal Armouries and also in the wider understanding of horse size in the period. Finally, the Warwick Shaffron's outlying width measurements are most likely to accommodate extra padding, either attached to the inside of the chaffron as a liner or worn separately by the horse beneath it. And if you'd like to know more, I'll leave this slide up with some details of further resources. Thank you.
Thank you. If you'd like to come over and join me, we'll get this microphone working. Yes. So hopefully, having given everyone on YouTube a chance to free screen, take screenshots, I'll take the slides down. Ellie, if I could start you off with a question from an anonymous attendee on Zoom. Do we know if this piece, or indeed any of the chaffrons that we've got, are they for a specific horse, or are they mass-produced in a kind of one-size-fits-all approach?
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So the answer is I don't know. As far as I know, we don't have evidence of the objects in the Armouries collection being made specifically for a specific horse. But with some of the more fancy examples and later examples, that is possible. But we do have a collection of chaffrons that were probably made for Henry VIII's heavy cavalry in the early 16th century. And these are more of a munitions quality, and they seem to be a sort of small, medium, large situation that may have arrived in bulk and then just been sort of passed down, and which horse does this fit? That's close enough, that kind of thing. But yeah, difficult to know. And I guess with lining, you know, maybe a thicker lining helps a larger horse armour fit a smaller horse. I don't know.
Essentially, I was going to ask, in the context of craftsmanship, so are these being made by special, as far as we know, because I know that obviously makers marks and like tend to be rare. Do we know if these are made by your standard armour smith who's branching out a little bit, or are they specialist chaffron makers? Is it a more prestigious or less prestigious occupation than for the man?
Great question. They're probably made by the same armourers that are making armour for the man, and you often have in the 16th century horse armours that match the armour for the man. So obviously the decoration it'll be decorated by somebody else, not the armourer, but they are sort of made en suite. So yes, it's probable that it's the same workshop that's making the armour for the man.
Fascinating. So I haven't seen any hands in the audience. If you would like to question, stick your hand up and let us know. I did have another one from, oh, love it. Yes, could I take one from you?
I was interested about the liners and the padding used on the chaffrons. Do you have any idea what they were made of or what they were stuffed with?
So just for the benefit of the people who may not have heard that, so that's what are the liners either made of or stuffed with?
Yeah, it's interesting because so the lining on the two that I showed you in the slide, it's only very thin, but probably stuffed or with an additional something else. The textile itself is something of a coarse weave, so almost like a sacking type material, and they were probably stuffed with something like grass or or horse hair, something like that. But I don't know of any surviving that has the stuffing in.
On that note, just to jump in, on that note of survivals, how do we know that they had papier-mâché chaffrons? Because presumably that doesn't survive all to this day.
No, that's to do with sort of more mask and costume events. So yeah.
Great. So yes, question at the back.
Hi, I've known that chaffron for 30 years, and it has left me confused all of those years. And it's wonderful to hear about the measurements from the poll down to the nose, but no part of that chaffron makes any sense width-wise to me. And I don't understand. I joust quite a lot, or did in the past. So fitting chaffrons was something I did every day. And also it was very specific to the horse that you were going to wear. I can't contend that it was actually a practicable piece of kit. So I was wondering whether there was any ideas of possibly making a replica and seeing if it actually works. So my question was basically, I think it's a terrible piece of kit, that's why there's only one of them. And possibly I might be terribly, terribly wrong. And then it might be for an early form of joust where the horse might be more liable to be hit by a stray lance. But even so, the quality of a 1mm, 2mm steel and the small amount of padding that normally goes with a chaffron or any other piece of kit covering the horse should be more than enough, and enough is a feast. So it's always bamboozled me, the width. So at the end of that, working archaeology, can we make one, please?
So for the audience at home, that was a question in relay. Has it been considered at any stage to make a replica and see if it works in practice? Because presumably we won't put the original on a real horse.
Not that I know of, and not from the armories. No.
There we go. Another potential output from the warhorse. Let's give it a go. Andy brought up an interesting question about the thickness, which I'd touch on if possible. If there are any questions online, let us have them, but I'll just ask this one quickly. The metal thickness. Do we suspect that's a deliberate design choice of these areas need protecting most, or is it the result of trying to spread out a piece of metal to cover a very, very unusually shaped object?
Yeah, short answer is I don't know.
Okay.
But it is thin in some areas, but I do wonder if that is general corrosion, or I don't know. It's difficult. Later chaffrons are thicker, and the tournament chaffrons that we have are much thicker. So I don't know.
So another one where maybe the only example is for us to make one and hit it with a lot of things, see how it turns out. A question from another anonymous attendee on Zoom. Is there likely to be a book from the Warhorse project?
Yes, there is a book from the Warhorse project. I believe it's due to come out next year, but more detail on that I think will be available on the project's blog, which you can find through the webpage. But yes, there's going to be a comprehensive book of with a number of articles from a number of the disciplines, which are really interesting. So information about the documentary evidence, so studs, landscapes, that kind of thing. It's going to be a really great publication. So keep an eye out for that.
Yes, and equally, if you can't wait, there's plenty of material on the project website. If this fueled your interest, please do go there. There's a question, and so I'm wary of asking this because I know that you're not a reenactor, you're not a rider. But Highlands had a question. That must be difficult to put on a horse. Do we know anything about the training of the medieval warhorse and how willing they were to subject themselves to things like this?
Yeah, so I don't know a lot about horse training in this period, except to say that the warhorses were specially trained, and I suppose the only follow-up I could add to that is that they are clearly wearing this material because the material exists and is in images and used on the battlefield, etc. How long a horse will stand it, I don't know. But yeah.
Any more questions from the audience here? I was gonna that brought me on to a question about sources, but I know that sources are deathly dull to everyone, so I was going to only hold it if no one had anything better. How far do you trust medieval illustrations for this kind of thing? Because anyone who's familiar with social media will see all the bizarre things that you can find in medieval manuscripts, but they're generally reliable as far as armour goes.
Yes and no. So I think the key thing, as I mentioned in the lecture, is that you've got to be wary of when something has been made and what is it depicting. So the two examples, the Froissart and the Beecham pageant, are much later representations of an earlier tournament event. So it's more likely that those are depicting an earlier event but depicting it in later equipment. I guess it does have to be taken with a pinch of salt. Obviously, it's really difficult to know exactly what materials are necessarily being used. Sometimes the colour is a dead giveaway. So if it's blue or grey, it's probably metal. But I was going to include it, and I wish I had now, but there's a really great manuscript illustration of a horse shown from the front, and it looks nothing like a horse. And it's just really clear that the illustrator just either can't draw or has never seen a horse from the front. So is there a little bit of that going on with the armour, maybe?
I mean, as someone with no artistic talent whatsoever, I can only sympathise with the people who are doing it on medieval parchment, etc.
The representations of armour, arms and armour in surviving iconography does often correspond to the surviving material. So, yeah.
So just one very quick one, if I may, because the answer may be, I'll check on the website, but experimental archaeology. Has the Warhorse project done much of that?
What do you mean by experimental archaeology?
Well, thinking along the lines of making the chaffrons, trying to put them on people, potentially alongside, we mentioned identifying the different marks on the chaffron. Have we done anything around practically testing that out, or is that based on looking at cross sections, or is it just guesswork on our part?
Yeah, it's based. I don't know. I don't think the Warhorse project has done any of that yet. And the Warwick Shaffron, as far as I know, it hasn't been tested from the armories or anything. But yeah, the understanding of the potential weapons that are making those marks is based on cross sections and things.
Yes, but plenty of other material to have a look at. So if people want to find out more, where should they go?
So definitely the Warhorse Project page. There's also a very new open access article, details of which are on the last slide.
Yes.
I can put that back up if.
I was going to say, I have dropped them into the Zoom chat. Josh hopefully has put them in the YouTube chat. If not, they will be in the description. If you're watching this again, you scroll to the bottom and you'll be able to find a link.
Super. That the article that's just come out is essentially expands on everything I've discussed today in much more detail and with referencing to other things you can look at. So.
Lovely, perfect. But yeah, so other than that, there's plenty of other ways to find out more. But thank you very much to Ellie for today's talk.
Thank you so much.
But thank you also to Josh behind the scenes for managing the feed to YouTube, which has not been without its issues today. But most of all, thank you to the audience, both in person and online, for attending, for your questions, comments, and engagement. The next talk in the series is in a fortnight. It will hopefully be in the War Cinema once again, and it is the last one in this winter lecture series. Dr. Kate Viggers, formerly of the museum, in fact, will talk to us about the women sent behind enemy lines in occupied France during the Second World War. That takes place on the 3rd of April at the same time in 2 weeks, and it'll be in the museum as well as online. All the details are on our website, royalarmouries.org. Please go there if you would like to find out more. But in the meantime, thank you again for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.